Marcus Blackwood stood at the edge of the abandoned warehouse district, his dark eyes scanning the shadows that stretched across the crumbling streets of downtown Detroit. As the most feared vampire in the city, he commanded respect from both the supernatural world and the criminal underworld. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, a creature of darkness who showed no mercy to those who crossed him. The wind carried the scent of rain and desperation through the air as Marcus adjusted his expensive black coat. He had built an empire over the past century, controlling everything from underground gambling rings to legitimate businesses that served as fronts for his darker operations. Money flowed through his hands like water, and power came as naturally to him as breathing once had when he was still human. But tonight felt different. Something gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. It started 3 days ago when his network of informants began reporting strange activities in the old section of town where he rarely ventured. Reports of an elderly woman who appeared to be living on the streets, relying on the kindness of a young homeless girl for survival. The description of the elderly woman had made Marcus's blood run cold. Silver hair that caught moonlight like spun silk, delicate features that time had weathered but not broken, and eyes the color of storm clouds. It couldn't be possible, yet the details matched perfectly with memories he had tried to bury for over 80 years. Eleanor Blackwood. His mother. The last time Marcus had seen her, she was lying in a hospital bed in 1943, her frail human body finally succumbing to the tuberculosis that had ravaged her lungs for months. He had held her hand as she drew her final breath, promising her that he would use his supernatural abilities to help people, to be better than the monster he had become. That promise had died with her, buried beneath years of anger, violence, and the intoxicating pull of power. Now, as he made his way through the maze of abandoned buildings and forgotten alleyways, Marcus tried to convince himself that his sources were wrong. The dead stayed dead, even in his world of supernatural impossibilities. His mother had been human, fragile and mortal, unlike the vampires, werewolves, and other creatures that populated the shadows of the modern world. The sound of gentle laughter drifted through the night air, stopping Marcus in his tracks. He knew that laugh. It had been the soundtrack of his childhood, the sound that had comforted him during thunderstorms and celebrated his small victories. His enhanced vampire hearing picked up every nuance, every familiar inflection that spoke to something deep in his chest where his heart had once beaten. Following the sound, Marcus found himself approaching a makeshift camp tucked between two crumbling buildings. Cardboard boxes had been arranged to create a shelter, and a small fire burned in a metal drum, casting dancing shadows on the brick walls. The scene was one of desperate poverty, the kind that most people hurried past without a second glance. But Marcus couldn't look away. There, sitting beside the fire, was the woman from his memories. Eleanor Blackwood looked exactly as she had on the day she died, her silver hair neatly braided despite her obvious circumstances, her posture still carrying the dignity that had defined her throughout her difficult life. She wore clothes that had seen better days, but she had arranged them with care, maintaining her appearance even in the face of homelessness. Beside her sat a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders and green eyes that sparkled with warmth despite the hardship written in the lines around them. She was thin, clearly malnourished, but she moved with a grace that spoke of inner strength. In her hands, she held a small bag of what appeared to be leftover food from a nearby restaurant. "Here, Mrs. Eleanor," the girl was saying, her voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "I managed to get some bread and soup from Tony's diner. The night manager there is pretty nice about letting me take home the stuff they were going to throw out anyway." Marcus watched as his mother accepted the offering with gratitude that made his chest tighten with an emotion he thought he had forgotten how to feel. "Thank you, Sarah," Eleanor replied, her voice exactly as he remembered it. "You're too kind to an old woman. You should eat more yourself. You're nothing but skin and bones." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and genuine despite their surroundings. "I'm fine, Mrs. Eleanor. Besides, you took care of me when I first got to the streets. Remember? I was so scared and confused, and you showed me which places were safe to sleep, which people to trust. You probably saved my life that first week." The conversation continued, but Marcus felt as though he was drowning in memories and impossibilities. His mother was alive, but she was homeless, relying on a girl who clearly had almost nothing herself. The woman who had raised him to believe in kindness and generosity was now the recipient of charity from someone whose society had forgotten. How was any of this possible? His mother had been buried in Graceland Cemetery over 80 years ago. He had stood at her graveside in his expensive black suit, one of only 3 mourners present, and watched as they lowered her simple wooden casket into the ground. He had paid for the funeral himself, using money from his early criminal enterprises, determined to give her the dignity in death that life had often denied her. Yet here she was, unchanged by the passage of time, sitting beside a fire in an abandoned part of the city, accepting food from a homeless teenager who looked like she needed every scrap for herself. Marcus stepped closer, staying within the shadows that seemed to bend around him naturally. His vampire abilities allowed him to move without making a sound, to observe without being detected. He needed to understand what was happening before he revealed himself. Too many questions swirled through his mind, too many possibilities that defied everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the supernatural world he had inhabited for over a century. "Sarah, dear," Eleanor was saying, "you mentioned that you've been having those dreams again. The ones about your family. Do you want to talk about them?" The girl's expression shifted, sadness replacing the earlier warmth. She set down her portion of the shared meal and stared into the flames. "They feel so real, Mrs. Eleanor. I can see my little brother's face, hear my mom calling my name. But then, I wake up, and I remember that they're gone. All of them. The accident took everything from me." Eleanor reached over and took Sarah's hand in hers, the gesture so familiar that Marcus felt transported back to his childhood when his mother would comfort him in exactly the same way after his father's drunken rages. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule, sweetheart. It comes and goes like waves on a shore. Some days the water is calm, and other days it threatens to pull you under. But you've survived this long, and that tells me you have strength you don't even recognize yet. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being punished," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like maybe I did something wrong, and that's why I lost everything. My family, my home, my chance at college. Maybe I deserve to be out here." "Don't you ever think that," Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that Marcus remembered from his youth. "Bad things happen to good people all the time. It doesn't mean they deserve it. It just means that life is complicated and unfair sometimes. But you, my dear Sarah, have one of the purest hearts I've ever encountered. The way you take care of others out here, the way you share what little you have, the way you look for the good in people even when they've given you no reason to trust them. That's not the behavior of someone who deserves punishment. That's the behavior of someone who understands what real strength looks like." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest as he listened to his mother offer the same kind of wisdom and comfort that had shaped his early years. Before the darkness consumed him, before power and violence became his tools for navigating the world, Eleanor Blackwood had taught him about compassion, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about finding light even in the deepest shadows. He had forgotten those lessons, buried them beneath decades of choices that would have broken his mother's heart. He had become exactly the kind of person she had tried to teach him not to be, someone who took advantage of the vulnerable, who used fear as a weapon, who valued power over people. Now, watching her care for this homeless girl with the same gentle strength she had once shown him, Marcus realized how far he had fallen from the man she had tried to raise him to be. Sarah was clearly struggling, clearly fighting battles that would have crushed many people her age, yet Eleanor was finding ways to build her up, to remind her of her worth, to help her see possibilities beyond their current circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most powerful supernatural creature in the city was standing in shadows, watching his long-dead mother take care of a homeless teenager, and the teenager was the one doing the taking care. Sarah had brought food to Eleanor, had sacrificed her own comfort to make sure the older woman was warm and fed. Meanwhile, Marcus controlled vast resources that he used primarily to increase his own power and intimidate his enemies. As the night grew deeper, Marcus continued to watch the unlikely pair. They shared stories, with Eleanor recounting tales from what she claimed was her youth during the Great Depression, and Sarah talking about dreams she still harbored despite her current situation. The girl wanted to be a teacher, she said, to work with children who came from difficult backgrounds, to be the kind of person who could make a difference in a young life when everything seemed hopeless. "You know," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "I had a son once who I thought might change the world. He was brilliant, determined, capable of such great things. But, somewhere along the way, he lost sight of what was truly important. He chose power over people, fear over love. I often wonder what he became, whether he ever found his way back to the person I knew he could be. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother was talking about him, even though she couldn't possibly know he was listening. But, somehow, her words felt like they were meant for his ears, like the universe was conspiring to force him to confront the man he had become versus the man she had tried to raise. Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of power did he choose? The kind that comes from making others afraid of you, Eleanor replied sadly. The kind that builds walls instead of bridges, that takes instead of gives. I tried to teach him that real strength comes from lifting others up, but I suppose the world showed him something different. I just hope that somewhere, somehow, he remembers the lessons I tried to teach him. I hope he finds his way back to his heart. As dawn approached, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He couldn't reveal himself, not yet. There were too many questions, too many impossibilities that he needed to understand. But, he could do something. He had resources, connections, power that could be used for something other than expanding his criminal empire. The next morning, Sarah would find an envelope tucked under the cardboard that served as their shelter's door. Inside would be enough cash to secure a small apartment for several months, along with information about social services that could help both women get back on their feet. There would be no indication of where the help had come from, no strings attached, no expectation of gratitude or recognition. For the first time in decades, Marcus Blackwood was going to use his power to protect rather than to intimidate, to give rather than to take. And, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way back to the person his mother had believed he could be. As he disappeared into the shadows of the awakening city, Marcus carried with him the sound of his mother's voice and the image of her gentle hands comforting a young woman who had nothing but still found ways to give. The Vampire King had learned something that night that all his power and fear couldn't teach him. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who seem to have the least, and sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to discover their own strength. The game had changed. Marcus just hoped he wasn't too late to learn how to play by his mother's rules instead of his own. The Vampire King Story, Part 2. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Blackwood first discovered his mother living on the streets, and the carefully ordered world he had built around himself was beginning to crumble. The anonymous envelope of money he had left for Eleanor and Sarah had been the first crack in a dam that was now threatening to burst completely. From his penthouse office overlooking the Detroit River, Marcus had been monitoring the situation through his network of informants and surveillance equipment he had strategically placed around the area. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the nature of survival itself. The money he had provided should have been enough to secure housing for both women for several months. Instead, Sarah had used most of it to help other homeless individuals in their community. She had bought winter coats for the elderly men who slept near the bridge, arranged for medical care for a woman suffering from infected wounds, and even paid the outstanding fines for a veteran whose unpaid tickets were preventing him from accessing shelter services. Eleanor had not only supported these decisions but had apparently been the driving force behind many of them. Marcus watched through hidden cameras as his mother held impromptu meetings around their fire, organizing the homeless community like a general marshalling troops for battle. She assigned tasks, mediated disputes, and somehow managed to create a sense of family among people who society had written off as lost causes. "James, you're good with electronics," Eleanor told a grizzled man in his 50s who had been living under the overpass for 3 years. "That woman Sarah met at the mission yesterday mentioned that the community center's computers are all broken. If we could get them fixed, the kids in the neighborhood would have a place to do homework and learn job skills." James nodded eagerly. "I used to work IT before everything went wrong. I'd be happy to take a look. Might be nice to feel useful again." Marcus found himself leaning forward as he watched the interaction unfold on his monitor. This was his mother, the same woman who had struggled to pay rent on their tiny apartment, organizing a volunteer workforce from among the city's most overlooked residents. She was creating something that his millions of dollars and network of criminal contacts had never achieved: genuine community. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to amaze him with her resilience and compassion. Despite being barely 20 years old and having lost everything, she had somehow become the unofficial social worker for their group. She spent her days navigating bureaucratic systems to help people access services, translating for those who spoke little English, and somehow managing to maintain hope in circumstances that would have crushed most people. "Mrs. Eleanor," Sarah said one evening as they shared a meager dinner, "I've been thinking about what you said about your son. About how he chose power over people. Do you think people can change? I mean, really change, not just pretend to be different?" Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited for his mother's response. Through the small microphone he had hidden near their fire, he could hear every word clearly. "I believe people can change," Eleanor said thoughtfully, stirring the small pot of soup they were sharing. "But I think it takes courage. It's easier to keep doing what you've always done, even if it makes you miserable, than it is to admit you've been wrong and try a different path. Change requires you to look honestly at yourself, and that's one of the hardest things a person can do." "What if someone has done really terrible things?" Sarah pressed. "What if they've hurt people, made choices that can't be undone? Is redemption even possible for someone like that?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her staring into the flames with an expression he remembered from childhood. It was the look she got when she was trying to find the right words to explain something complicated to his young mind. "I think," she finally said, "that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to do better going forward. It's about using whatever resources and abilities you have to create more good in the world than harm. Some wounds can't be healed, some damage can't be undone. But that doesn't mean the rest of a person's story is already written." As Marcus listened to this conversation, he felt something shifting inside him that he hadn't experienced in decades. It was uncomfortable, like a muscle that had been dormant for so long that using it again caused pain. He realized that what he was feeling was hope, mixed with a crushing sense of regret for all the years he had wasted choosing the easy path of intimidation and control. That night, he made his second anonymous intervention. But, this time, instead of just providing money, he used his connections more creatively. By morning, James would find a paying position at a legitimate computer repair shop owned by one of Marcus's front companies. The job came with health insurance and the opportunity to work toward industry certifications that could lead to better employment. But Marcus's actions were beginning to have unintended consequences. His sudden change in behavior was not going unnoticed by others in his organization. Vincent Torres, his second-in-command and the closest thing he had to a friend, confronted him in his office 3 days later. "Marcus, we need to talk," Vincent said, closing the door behind him and activating the white noise generator that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. "The others are starting to ask questions. You've been distracted, you've missed 2 important meetings, and yesterday you actually told Rodriguez to find a legal way to collect on the Peterson debt. Since when do you care about legal methods?" Marcus looked up from the surveillance footage he had been reviewing, studying Sarah's face as she helped an elderly woman navigate the social services office. "Maybe I'm just trying a different approach, Vincent. Efficiency doesn't always require violence." "This isn't about efficiency," Vincent replied, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "This is about you. You've been different for weeks now. Softer. And, in our line of work, soft gets you killed. There are already whispers that you might be losing your edge. Some of the younger guys are starting to wonder if maybe it's time for new leadership." The old Marcus would have reacted to this news with immediate violence. He would have called a meeting, made an example of whoever was questioning his authority, and reminded everyone why they had feared him in the first place. But, now, the thought of returning to those methods felt exhausting rather than empowering. "Let them wonder," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe fear isn't the best foundation for loyalty anyway." Vincent stared at him in shock. "Who are you and what did you do with Marcus Blackwood?" "The man I've known for 30 years doesn't question the effectiveness of fear. He uses it like a scalpel, precisely and without hesitation." "The man you've known for 30 years was an idiot," Marcus replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "I built an empire on making people afraid of me, and what do I have to show for it? Money I can't spend fast enough, power that requires constant violence to maintain, and the knowledge that everyone around me would disappear the moment they thought I couldn't hurt them anymore. That's not success, Vincent. That's just expensive loneliness." Over the following days, Marcus found himself making more and more decisions that prioritized helping others over expanding his influence. When a rival gang tried to move into territory near where Eleanor and Sarah were staying, instead of responding with his usual brutality, Marcus arranged for increased police patrols in the area. When he learned that the community center they had been trying to help was facing closure due to funding cuts, he anonymously donated enough money to keep it running for 5 years. But perhaps the most significant change came when Sarah was attacked. It happened on a Thursday night when she was returning from her job at a local restaurant. The manager had been impressed with her work ethic and reliability, despite her homeless status, and had been allowing her to take home leftover food for Eleanor and the others in their community. She was carrying a bag of sandwiches and soup when 3 men cornered her in an alley 6 blocks from where she and Eleanor were staying. Marcus learned about the attack through his surveillance network, but by the time his people could respond, it was already over. Sarah had been beaten, robbed of the food she was carrying, and left unconscious in the alley. She was found by a passerby 20 minutes later and taken to the emergency room with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and multiple bruises. When Eleanor arrived at the hospital, Marcus was already there, though he remained hidden in the shadows of the waiting room. He watched his mother pace the hallways with a fury he hadn't seen since his childhood, when she had confronted his father about his drinking and violence. This was Eleanor Blackwood at her most formidable, demanding answers from doctors, insisting on seeing Sarah despite visiting hour restrictions, and somehow managing to navigate the complex hospital bureaucracy with the determination of a woman who would not be denied. "That sweet girl has never hurt anyone in her life," Eleanor told the nurse who was trying to explain why she couldn't stay overnight in Sarah's room. "She takes care of people, helps people, gives everything she has to make other people's lives a little easier. And now she's lying in there hurt and scared, and you're telling me she has to face that alone? I don't think so." The nurse, a woman who had probably dealt with difficult family members countless times, seemed to recognize something in Eleanor's tone that made her reconsider. "Well, I suppose if you're family." "I am," Eleanor said firmly. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice. That girl is the closest thing to a daughter I have, and I'm not leaving her." As Marcus listened to his mother defend Sarah with such fierce devotion, he realized that he was witnessing something he had never fully understood before. This was what real power looked like. Not the ability to make people afraid, but the ability to make them feel protected, valued, loved. Eleanor had no money, no influence in any traditional sense, yet she had just convinced a hospital to bend their rules through sheer force of moral authority and genuine care. That night, while Sarah slept fitfully in her hospital bed with Eleanor holding vigil beside her, Marcus made phone calls that would change everything. By morning, the 3 men who had attacked Sarah would be in police custody, facing charges not just for assault but for a series of other crimes that Marcus's resources had uncovered. Their victims included several other homeless individuals who had been too afraid to report the attacks, believing that no one would care about crimes against people like them. But Marcus didn't stop there. He arranged for Sarah to receive the best medical care available, though she would never know that her insurance paperwork had been mysteriously expedited and her bills mysteriously covered by clerical errors in the system. He made sure that the community center received additional security funding, and he began implementing a network of protection that would make the streets safer for everyone, not just those under his direct influence. The attack on Sarah had crystallized something for Marcus. He could continue to rule through fear, maintaining his empire while ignoring the suffering happening just miles from his luxury penthouse. Or he could use his resources the way his mother had taught him to use his abilities as a child, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For the first time in over 80 years, Marcus Blackwood began to remember what it felt like to be proud of his own actions. And, for the first time since his transformation into a vampire, he began to wonder if redemption might actually be possible, even for someone like him. The game was definitely changing. The question now was whether he would be strong enough to see it through to the end. #The Vampire King Story, Part 3. 2 months after the attack on Sarah, Marcus Blackwood's carefully constructed criminal empire was teetering on the edge of collapse, and he had never felt more alive in his century of existence. The changes he had been making to his operations, the resources he had been redirecting toward legitimate charitable causes, and his refusal to respond to challenges with his traditional brutality had created a power vacuum that his rivals were eager to fill. Vincent Torres stood in Marcus's office, his face grim with the weight of bad news. They're calling for a meeting, Marcus. All the major players. Word on the street is that they think you've gone soft, that you're no longer capable of protecting your territory. Rodriguez is openly claiming that you've lost your nerve, and he's got backing from the Kowalski family and the Eastern European Syndicate. Marcus didn't look up from the report he was reading about the community center's expanded programs. Since his anonymous donations had started flowing, the center had been able to offer job training, childcare, and educational support to dozens of families in the area. The success stories detailed in the report meant more to him than any profit margin his criminal enterprises had ever generated. Let them meet, Marcus said calmly. Let them talk. They're going to do what they're going to do regardless of whether I waste energy worrying about it. You don't understand, Vincent pressed, his frustration evident. They're not just talking. They're moving. Rodriguez hit 2 of our operations last week. The Kowalskis are pressuring our contacts in the police department to stop looking the other way. And there are rumors that someone has put a price on your head. For the first time in the conversation, Marcus looked up. But, instead of the cold fury that Vincent expected to see, he found something that looked almost like peace in his old friend's eyes. Vincent, how long have we known each other? Marcus asked. 32 years, Vincent replied immediately. Since that night when you pulled me out of that warehouse fire and offered me a place in your organization. And, in all that time, have you ever seen me truly happy? Not satisfied, not victorious, but actually happy? Vincent considered the question seriously. No, I don't think I have. Confident, powerful, successful, but not happy. Why? Marcus set down the community center report and walked to the window that overlooked the city. Far below, he could see the lights of the district where Eleanor and Sarah were building their unlikely community of hope among the homeless and forgotten. Because I've been doing everything wrong, Vincent. For over a century, I've been accumulating power like it was the only thing that mattered, and all it's done is make me feel empty. I thought strength meant making people afraid of me, but I've been watching real strength for the past few months, and it looks nothing like what I built here. Before Vincent could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Sarah had been readmitted to the hospital. The stress and poor nutrition of street life, combined with the injuries from her attack, had taken a toll on her health that her young body couldn't handle indefinitely. She was suffering from pneumonia and severe anemia, and the doctors were concerned about her ability to fight off the infection. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his coat. I have to go. Where? Vincent called after him. Marcus, we need to deal with this situation. If you don't show strength soon, we're going to have a war on our hands. Then, we'll have a war, Marcus said, pausing at the door. But, right now, there's somewhere I need to be. The hospital corridors had become familiar territory for Marcus over the past weeks. He had spent countless hours in the shadows, watching Eleanor maintain her vigil beside Sarah's bed, listening to the conversations between the 2 women that had slowly been reshaping his understanding of what it meant to be strong. Tonight, however, felt different. As Marcus approached Sarah's room, he could hear Eleanor's voice, but it carried a note of desperation that he had never heard before. You fight, sweetheart, Eleanor was saying, her voice thick with unshed tears. You've been fighting your whole life, and you don't get to give up now. There are too many people who need you, too many lives you haven't touched yet. Marcus peered into the room and felt his heart clench at the sight. Sarah looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored her vital signs with electronic beeps that seemed far too weak. Eleanor sat beside her, holding her hand with the same gentle strength she had once used to comfort a young Marcus during his childhood illnesses. I'm so tired, Mrs. Eleanor, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I feel like I've been running uphill my entire life, and I don't know if I can keep going. I know you're tired, Eleanor replied, smoothing Sarah's hair away from her fevered forehead. I know it feels impossible sometimes. But, you've given so much hope to so many people. James got that promotion at the computer shop and he's going to be able to get his own apartment next month. Maria's daughter started college because you helped her navigate the scholarship applications. Thomas has been sober for 6 weeks because you convinced him he was worth saving. You've changed lives, sweetheart.
You've made the world better just by being in it.
As Marcus listened to his mother catalog the ways that Sarah had touched other people's lives, he felt something crystallize inside him. This was what he wanted his legacy to be. Not fear, not control, not the ability to destroy those who opposed him, but the knowledge that he had made life better for people who needed help. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the hospital room. Eleanor looked up as he entered, and, for a moment, time seemed suspended between them. Her storm-gray eyes, so familiar and, yet impossible, studied his face with the same intensity she had once used to read his moods as a child. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by a complex mixture of emotions that played across her features like clouds passing over the sun. "Marcus," she whispered, and the sound of his name in her voice nearly brought him to his knees. He had planned this moment countless times over the past months, imagining what he would say, how he would explain the impossible fact of her presence, how he would account for the man he had become versus the boy she had raised. But, now, faced with the reality of seeing his mother again after 80 years, all his carefully rehearsed words abandoned him. "Hello, Mom," he said simply, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. Sarah's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the new voice, and she looked back and forth between Eleanor and Marcus with confusion evident despite her fever.
"Mrs. Eleanor? Who is this?"
Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, never taking her eyes off Marcus's face. "This is my son," she said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable despite the circumstances.
"The one I told you about. The one who lost his way."
"The one who's trying to find it again," Marcus corrected gently. He moved closer to Sarah's bed, noting how her breathing seemed labored, how her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of a body under extreme stress. "Sarah, I'm going to make sure you get the best medical care available.
Money is no object. Whatever you need." "I don't understand," Sarah said weakly. "Why would you help me? I don't even know you."
Marcus looked at Eleanor, drawing strength from her encouraging nod. "Because you took care of my mother when I wasn't there to do it myself.
Because you've spent your life helping other people even when you had nothing to give.
Because she's right, you've made the world better just by being in it, and the world needs more people like you." Over the next several hours, Marcus orchestrated a level of medical intervention that Sarah's condition required but that her insurance would never have covered. Specialists were consulted, treatments were expedited, and somehow the administrative barriers that normally prevented homeless individuals from receiving premium care mysteriously disappeared. But, more importantly, Marcus finally had the conversation with his mother that he had been both longing for and dreading for months. They talked through the night in the hospital waiting room, speaking in the low tones of people who were sharing secrets and confessions. Eleanor explained that she didn't fully understand her own existence, only that she had awakened one day in the same cemetery where Marcus had buried her, with no memory of the intervening decades but with a clear sense that she had work to do. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that some stories aren't finished just because someone dies.
I think sometimes the universe gives us second chances to set things right."
Marcus told her about his life since her death, about the choices he had made, the empire he had built, and the man he had become. He expected judgment, anger, disappointment. Instead, Eleanor listened with the same patient attention she had given him as a child, asking questions that helped him understand his own motivations better than years of self-reflection had managed. "You know," she said when he finished his story, "I'm not surprised that you chose power when you felt powerless. What surprises me is how long it took you to remember that there are different kinds of power.
The kind that comes from helping people is so much stronger than the kind that comes from hurting them." As dawn broke over the city, Sarah's condition began to stabilize.
The treatments were working, and her body was beginning to fight off the infection with renewed strength. Marcus had arranged for her to be transferred to a long-term care facility where she could recover properly and receive the support she needed to regain her health completely. But, even as his personal world was finding new balance, his professional world was crumbling around him. Vincent appeared in the hospital waiting room just as the sun was rising, his face grim with urgency. "Marcus, they're coming," he said without preamble. "Rodriguez, the Kowalskis, all of them. They've decided that you're weak, that it's time for new leadership. They'll be at the warehouse district in 2 hours, and they're expecting you to show up and prove that you're still the same man who built this empire through blood and fear." Eleanor looked between Marcus and Vincent, understanding immediately what was being discussed.
This is your old life calling you back, she said quietly. The question is, what kind of man do you choose to be?
Marcus stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He could return to his old methods, use his supernatural abilities to remind everyone why they had feared him in the first place. It would be effective, it would be decisive, and it would solve his immediate problems while destroying everything he had been building toward redemption. Or he could choose a different path entirely. Vincent, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of authority that his friend hadn't heard in months, I want you to call Rodriguez and tell him I'll meet with them. But not at the warehouse. At the community center. And tell him to bring everyone who thinks they can take what I've built.
Marcus, that's not neutral territory, Vincent protested.
You'll be surrounded by civilians, people who could get hurt if things go wrong.
Exactly, Marcus replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Which means everyone will have to be on their best behavior.
3 hours later, Marcus Blackwood walked into the community center where Sarah had been volunteering, where Eleanor had been organizing neighborhood improvement projects, where dozens of people had been given second chances at life through anonymous donations and mysterious interventions. The center's main room had been cleared for the meeting, but Marcus had made sure that the building's other activities continued as normal. Children were in classrooms down the hall, elderly residents were attending a social program in the adjacent room, and job training classes were proceeding as scheduled in the basement. Rodriguez and his allies had expected to meet in some abandoned warehouse where intimidation tactics and violence could be used freely. Instead, they found themselves in a place where raised voices would disturb children, where weapons would endanger innocent people, where the very environment demanded a different kind of conversation. This is highly irregular, Blackwood, Rodriguez said, clearly uncomfortable with the setting.
This isn't how these things are done.
Maybe it's time we changed how things are done, Marcus replied calmly. He gestured to the artwork covering the walls, pictures drawn by children, photos of community events, certificates recognizing volunteers who had made a difference.
Tell me, Rodriguez, when was the last time anything you built made a 5-year-old smile? When was the last time your actions helped someone find a job, get clean, discover hope? That's not what we do, Rodriguez snarled. We're not social workers, Blackwood. We're businessmen. Are we? Marcus asked.
Because I've been looking at our books lately, examining what we actually produce versus what we consume.
And, you know what I found? We're parasites. We take from our communities, we weaken the people around us, we create fear and desperation. We don't build anything real or lasting.
We just find new ways to extract resources from people who usually can't afford to lose them.
The room fell silent except for the distant sound of children's laughter from the educational programs continuing elsewhere in the building.
Marcus's words had hit their mark because they were true, and everyone in the room knew it.
So here's what I'm proposing, Marcus continued. We change the game entirely.
Instead of fighting each other for control over illegal enterprises that ultimately make our neighborhoods worse places to live, we use our resources and our organizational abilities to make things better.
We become legitimate businesses that provide services people actually need.
We invest in our communities instead of bleeding them dry.
And if we refuse, asked Kowalski, his voice carrying the implied threat that everyone understood.
Marcus smiled, and, for the first time in months, there was something genuinely dangerous in his expression. But it wasn't the cold menace of his earlier years. It was something warmer but more implacable, like a parent protecting children. Then, you'll discover that the same abilities I used to build a criminal empire work just as well for building other kinds of organizations. The same networks I used to control illegal activities can be used to support legal ones.
The same influence I wielded through fear can be wielded through hope.
And you'll find that people fight much harder for someone who's trying to help them than they ever fought for someone who was just trying to use them. The meeting continued for 2 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Marcus had changed the rules of the game so completely that his former rivals couldn't figure out how to play by the old ones. Some of them, intrigued by his vision or simply tired of the constant violence and uncertainty of their previous lives, agreed to consider his proposals. Others, too committed to the old ways to envision anything different, left angry but reluctant to start a war in a building full of children and community volunteers. That evening, Marcus returned to the hospital to find Sarah sitting up in bed, her color much improved and her eyes bright with returning health. Eleanor sat beside her, reading aloud from a book about social work techniques that Marcus had anonymously arranged to have delivered to the room. "You're looking better," Marcus said, settling into the visitor's chair that had become his regular spot over the past few days. "I'm feeling better," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Eleanor tells me I have you to thank for the medical care I received." "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Marcus said. "You took care of my mother when I couldn't. You showed her kindness when the world had given her nothing but hardship. You reminded me what real strength looks like. Trust me, if anyone owes anyone anything, it's me owing you." Sarah looked between Marcus and Eleanor with the dawning understanding of someone finally seeing the full picture. "You're really her son. The one she talks about, the one she hoped would find his way back to being the person she raised him to be." "I'm trying to be," Marcus admitted. "It's harder than I thought it would be, changing everything you've been for so long. But I'm learning that some things are worth the difficulty." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, her touches gentle and reassuring as he remembered from childhood. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Not for what you accomplished before, but for what you chose to become. It takes real courage to admit you've been wrong and to commit to doing better." Over the following months, Marcus systematically dismantled his criminal empire and rebuilt it as a network of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. The process was complex, dangerous, and expensive, but it was also surprisingly rewarding. For the first time in over a century, he was building something that made the world better instead of worse. Sarah recovered fully and, with Marcus's support, enrolled in college to pursue her dream of becoming a social worker. She continued to live with Eleanor in the small apartment that Marcus had secured for them, and the two women became the heart of a community support network that helped dozens of other homeless individuals transition to stable housing and employment. Eleanor never fully explained the mystery of her return, and Marcus stopped asking. Some gifts, he learned, were meant to be accepted rather than understood. What mattered was that she was there, that he had been given a second chance to be the son she had tried to raise, and that together they were building something worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. The Vampire King had learned the most important lesson of his long existence: true power wasn't about making people fear you. It was about giving them reasons to hope. And, sometimes, when you're very lucky, you get the chance to remember who you were always meant to be. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the community center's main room, watching Eleanor lead a volunteer meeting while Sarah conducted a job training session in the corner. His supernatural abilities remained, his vast resources were intact, and his influence in the city had actually grown stronger than it had ever been when it was based on fear. But, now, instead of ruling through intimidation, he led through inspiration. Instead of taking from his community, he invested in it. And, instead of being a source of darkness in the world, he had chosen to become a source of light. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it wasn't complete. Some days, the old impulses toward violence and control still surfaced, especially when he encountered injustice or cruelty. But now he had something he hadn't possessed for decades. He had people who believed in his better nature, who expected him to live up to the potential they saw in him, who loved him not for his power but for his willingness to use it wisely. As he watched his mother and Sarah work together to help others rebuild their lives, Marcus Blackwood finally understood what his mother had been trying to teach him all those years ago. Strength wasn't about what you could take from the world. It was about what you chose to give back to it. And, for the first time in over a century, the Vampire King was truly at peace.